Hello and welcome to The Long March. I'm Stan Grant. As the Chinese Communist Party celebrates its centenary, the country has seen a media blitz promoting a party-approved version of China's history. Anniversary celebrations included a light show, cannon salutes and patriotic songs. There was a military flyover above Tiananmen Square where thousands of specially selected people had gathered. President Xi Jinping addressed the nation and the world with a warning for foreign powers.
By
the same token, we will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate anyone who would attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people.
Well, Bloomberg China correspondent Tom McKenzie joined us earlier from Beijing, and I started by asking what the significance of this anniversary was.
This is really President Xi Jinping and the Communist Party marking 100 years, that centenary, 100 years since the founding of the Chinese Communist Party back in 1921. President Xi Jinping gave a speech at the Gate of Heavenly Peace in the Forbidden City overlooking Tiananmen Square. There was a military parade. There were hundreds of specially chosen spectators. And he gave a speech outlining and making the case for the Chinese Communist Party as being the best organization, the best party to continue to deliver prosperity for the Chinese people and to continue to defend the Chinese people. And of course, he went through what he saw as the successes of the Communist Party over the last 100 years, notably the economic and social changes here. And certainly President Xi Jinping and his team can point to some real changes there. You've got a country that will, by many data points and many metrics, be the largest economy in the world by the end of this decade. Life expectancy has gone up considerably. Per capita income has gone up a lot as well, noticeably. But of course, there are massive economic challenges facing this country, and the international picture for President Xi is looking increasingly difficult. You have international opinion that is very strongly turned against China because of its crackdowns in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and its handling of COVID-19. So domestically, going forward, it looks to be a tougher picture for President Xi Jinping and his team. Internationally as well, China is looking increasingly isolated.
And Tom, I'm wondering as well that how much influence the Chinese Communist Party has, particularly when you look at younger people in China, on everyday life.
Well, there are no surveys, or at least not many surveys, of the Chinese people and how people feel about the party and about events that are happening around them. I think it's fair to say that most people here in China are focused on their families, their jobs, education, schooling, the kind of things that most people all over the world are focused on. To the extent to which the Communist Party impedes on some of those aspirations and some of those parts of life, then it is important. But there's a generational divide as well. I was speaking to a young tech worker who works for one of the big e-commerce companies yesterday. He said, look, the Communist Party doesn't mean anything to me, to my parents. It is very important. But this is a party under Xi Jinping that is pushing more into areas like education and more into the private sector as well. The challenge in terms of the Communist Party is how they continue to ensure that people here see the party and a link to the party and see the party as being the organization that can help to continue to rise these levels in terms of life expectancy and the achievements they hope to carve out in life here. But it is an organization that Xi Jinping is trying to make more central to people's everyday lives here. But for many young people, the focus is simply on their jobs, on education and on their families.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has ruled the country now for 72 years. No other dictatorship has been able to transform itself from a famine-ravaged disaster to the world's second largest economy, a massive high-tech military and a vast entrepreneurial middle class. In 1949, Mao Zedong claimed victory in the Communist Revolution. The 100 years of humiliation was over. It had been a long march to power. From its humble beginnings in Shanghai in 1921, through a bloody civil war against American-backed nationalist forces and the brutal Japanese occupation. Mao now led the country to a new future. But ahead lay more death and more misery. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward to rapidly industrialise the country. Up to 40 million people are believed to have died in the Great Famine. By 1966, the country was in the midst of turmoil again. Mao's Cultural Revolution, a violent purge of what he called party traitors, led by Mao's youthful Red Guard. At the height of the Cultural Revolution, Australian opposition leader Gough Whitlam visited China. It came at a time when the West was looking to reset the China relationship. US President Richard Nixon followed, sitting down with Mao. Mao's death in 1976 set the country on a new course. By 1979, Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping launched his economic revolution, pulling back from old-style Mao communism while embracing Western capitalism. It rejuvenated the popularity of the party, but they cracked down on any hint of democracy.
After hours of shooting and facing a line of troops, the crowd is still here. They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
In 1989, Deng ordered his troops to fire on their own people in Tiananmen Square. The next 3 decades would see China become one of the world's biggest economies, reclaim Hong Kong, and host the 2008 Summer Olympics. By the time Xi Jinping takes power in 2012, the old Deng dictum of hide your capacity and bide your time is over. For an atheist country, the new religion is the party itself. Xi launched his revolution on a global stage. He's targeted rivals at home in a crackdown on corruption, jailed dissidents, quashed democracy protests, and in an effort to harmonise the country, has locked up what some say is up to 1 million Uyghurs. The United States is among a range of nations now calling that genocide. Xi Jinping has proclaimed himself president for life and has set China against the West in what has been called a new Cold War. His China dream is to complete what Mao and Deng had started, reclaiming Chinese territory, threatening to invade Taiwan to reunify with the mainland, spreading Chinese economic growth around the world, and returning China to the apex of global power, all to set up another 100 years of Communist Party rule. Well, let's bring in our panel now. Qinduo Xu is a political analyst at the Pango Institute in Beijing. Linda Javen is an author specialising for many, many years in China. And David Brophy is a senior lecturer in modern Chinese history at Sydney University. It's great to have all of you with us. And Linda, I really want to get your thoughts immediately on what you saw today and the message that was deliberately being sent here, domestically, but also overseas.
I think that it was an extraordinary spectacle. And, you know, this is not the usual thing for party anniversaries. And it's worth pointing out in this context that the party wasn't actually founded on July 1st, but July 23rd. 20 years later, when Mao wanted to commemorate this for the first time, nobody could remember the exact date. So they settled on the 1st. It has been a process of rewriting that history ever since. And what's absolutely fascinating about today was the similarities and the differences with large-scale rallies in both the Mao era and the Deng era. So one thing that struck me was, you know, in the Mao, I mean, one thing is they were sitting down. In the Mao era, they all had to stand. And in the Deng era, there was still a little bit of room for spontaneity in these celebrations. I'm not talking about the July 1st ones, I'm talking about the National Day ones, which were the only really big ones. He was definitely giving a message of pride and modernity and everything else. And he has talked about in recent months making China affable, a lovable nation. And this is to counter some of this wolf warrior stuff, some of the declining soft power and so on. But what we saw today was, along with a thanks to our many friends around the world, there was a lot of soft stuff before that. He was very clear, and he used, I think, 血肉, you know, bloody meat. You know, this is what's going to happen to people if they run against the Chinese people represented or defended by their army, which is the great of iron.
And Linda, can I just take that thought? Because that's what really jumped out at me. I think it's jumped out at everybody, Qinduo, and that is the language that was used here. Yes, there was recognition of the Chinese Communist Party's achievements. Yes, there was a celebration, but there was unmistakably, Qinduo, a warning here. The language that Linda has pointed out, the language of bashing heads and a wall of steel or a wall of iron. Why was it necessary to use this sort of language? Why is it necessary to have a confrontational tone, even aggressive tone, to what we saw today?
Stan, you raised a very interesting point. I think partly because of the Chinese language, you know, sometimes people want to express an idea. They tend to use the vivid languages, like in this case, use blood or meat here. Basically, that's the, you know, expression of resolve to defend the interests of the nation. So China will not be subjugated to foreign powers. China will defend its territorial integrity and national unity, sovereignty. That's it. But if you look at the entire speech, 99.99% of the speech is about the party, basically the past, the present, and the future, the challenges, achievements, and how the party needs to continue to work hard for its next mission, Centenary goal in 2049, and also next 100 years of the party.
David Brophy, yes, a lot of the speech was about the achievements of the party. Qinduo was right. But that language, in this time, in this context, when we've been hearing the talk of the drumbeats of war and talk of a new Cold War, where Xi Jinping himself has said that he reserves the right to invade Taiwan if necessary for reunification, surely this was a message that was considered and deliberately sent.
No, indeed. I mean, Xi Jinping is sending a message that he's very serious about his intentions to lead the party forward towards his vision of China's future as a strong nation with superpower status. And specifically, he's indicating that China, under his leadership, will not be strong-armed into, for example, relinquishing its claims to Taiwan, which is a key benchmark that's been laid out for the next few decades of party rule to resolve that dispute in the favour of the Chinese Communist Party. What we're seeing at the moment is a rhetorical escalation on both sides. So while it's alarming to see that kind of language from the podium in Beijing, we're all familiar here in Australia with the way that we have too gone to new levels in discussing the possibility of war and the need to prepare for war. So there is sort of hardline rhetoric emerging on both sides, and I think that is something we need to be very conscious of.
David, can I just come in there and just stay with you on that thought, because you have written a lot in your recent book, China Panic, about trying to steer away from the hawkish language or the talk of war or being led by the intelligence agencies, security agencies. And yet this is unmistakably a tense time. It is Xi Jinping who is saying he reserves the right to invade Taiwan. It is Xi Jinping who has claimed and militarised the South China Sea in spite or in defiance of rulings from The Hague. This is not just rhetoric, is it?
No, indeed. I mean, I think there's every reason to be anxious about the possibility that China may begin to engage in more typical superpower behaviour by declaring spheres of interest in its region that it defends militarily, by potentially becoming embroiled in situations internationally where it sees the the military option as a solution. I think that what we need to recognise, though, is that we've lived through 2 or 3 decades of American unilateralism that has effectively laid out a precedent for that kind of behaviour from countries with superpower status. So I just think that we need to confront these kinds of concerns that we have regarding China's potential direction within a wider systemic analysis of the roots of these kinds of conflicts and adopt solutions that de-escalate and diffuse the potential for conflict here, rather than choosing to stoke it, as I see the Australian government doing at the moment.
Chindwal, I'll come back to you. Linda, I want to come to you just in a moment and get your thoughts on how we can potentially navigate this time. But Chindwal, there are questions here to ask, aren't there, about the Chinese Communist Party, how it sees itself, that it's been accused of having a siege mentality, of being fragile, of being brittle, of being overly sensitive to criticism. When you have a 100-year celebration such as this, why is there not room to also look at the failings that led to the Great Famine, at what happened with the Tiananmen massacre, to look at the criticism that comes from abroad and reflect on that? Does this go to some underlying sense of weakness in the party, that it can't meet those criticisms and have that introspection and self-examination and talk openly about things like what happened in '89 in Tiananmen?
Stan, you mentioned another good point about Chinese culture. In general, if you are familiar with Chinese culture in official occasions, in big ceremonies, usually you focus on the achievements and the positive side of the story. And also, there's, of course, there's no evasion about what happened, for example, Cultural Revolution, for example, the Great Leap Forward, the economic disaster. For the CPC, from a revolutionary party to after 1949 to become the ruling party is a challenge for the party. Somehow they started from the scratch. For example, the first 5-year plan, they sent a delegation to Moscow to ask for advice if this plan will work. And in the late 1950s, I believe, Great Leap Forward, they set the goals and targets too high to realize those goals. And of course, there's an economic price to pay. And then, gradually, they are doing better and better, in particular since 1978, the opening up and the reform. You see, the country has transformed itself from an economic backwater to the second largest economy. Actually, China is the largest in terms of many other criteria. For example, in the renewable energy, 1/3 of the patents are from China. China is the largest producer and installer of the renewable energy, for example, wind turbine, etc.
We certainly had that message today. I do want to stop you there, though, because, of course, we've heard a lot about the achievements, but there are also questions, I think, Linda, to ask about Xi Jinping and how Xi Jinping sees himself. Does he see himself as the man of history, the man of destiny, completing the China dream? And should we see that as a threat?
No.
So sorry, Chindwal, I'll just go to Linda. Apologies.
I don't think we need to see that particular thing as a threat to us. I think we need to understand we really need to understand Xi Jinping and his rhetoric in terms of what he wants to achieve in China and the world, which is, I think we just have to separate it out. I'm very much with David on this. I think we have to be very calm with our rhetoric. My feeling is that we have been way too hyperbolic. Yes, Xi Jinping's rhetoric can be very hyperbolic, but we can actually we can only control our own. Now, Xi Jinping has painted a picture today and before today of a party that was destined from that meeting in July 1921 to lead China. This is the way that history is written. It's very important to understand. They present it as an inevitability. The great, glorious, and correct Chinese party rules today because it was always meant to. And I think it is very important, like you say, that how history is told, to understand what goes on. So, for example, in the early 1960s, Lu Dingyi, who was a political commissar, said, let's not write any more histories of ourselves because it's a little bit messy. And recently, I think this week, there were orders that all the historical archives, dicey or controversial parts of the historical archives were going to be sealed and forever. So I think there is this desperation. What we have to understand is the slight desperation that is behind a party that would seal its records, that has launched the biggest Tiananmen surveillance.
It has indeed been described as a fragile superpower, precisely because of those things that you've outlined there. But certainly an extraordinary display that we saw today, and enormous achievements, as we pointed out, that the party has made during the past 70 years. It's been terrific to talk to all of you. Chin Dwar, thank you so much. Linda, always good to see you. And David Brophy, appreciate you appearing on the program as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So what role does the media play in helping the Communist Party to not only maintain but build its power at home? Liu Xin is the anchor of the English language news channel CGTN, China Global Television Network. I spoke to her earlier this week on China Tonight and asked her about the role of the media in China.
Here in China, for the domestic audience, the role of the media has been one of a bridge, one to inform policymakers, to inform the general public, but overall to increase understanding of different sectors of society, so people can rally behind the same goals for the future. So it's very much a uniting factor instead of a factor that pitch one part of the society against another.
So what is it like to tell the story of China? We're fortunate to be joined by two correspondents who have had extensive experience on the ground. And for the ABC, Bill Birtles and Helena Chung have both reported from China for the ABC, and they join us now. It's great to have both of you with us. Helena, I want to go to your experience in the 1980s, going to China. Such a different time, a different world. What was it like to report China then?
It was extremely difficult. It was like banging my head against a brick wall. The telephone lines were impossible. I had to wait sometimes for 5 hours, phoning repeatedly through a Chinese switch to get a line through to Sydney, and then it might be so terrible it would crash, they couldn't use it. I used to regularly lose my voice through shouting over the telephone lines, trying to get a line. That was terrible. And of course, there were not the communication systems of today. There was only the telephone and a telex. So we were quite isolated. And the sources of news were almost zero.
Yeah, and Bill, listening to that, there were always obstacles of a technical nature then, but of a very different nature, of course, when you were reporting, and we all know the story about how you had to leave the country as well. Tell us about that experience of being up close with what is now recognised as an authoritarian superpower with Xi Jinping at the helm.
Well, I don't think any foreign journalists these days, Stan, are having an easy time over there. We certainly didn't. It would have been a different set of challenges to the 1980s, although I'm pretty sure the 1980s would have been pretty restrictive too. But now it's much easier, obviously, with the technology and travelling around the country. But it's just in the past couple of years, things have really tightened up. You see that in the access, the ability to ring up somebody in business or academia and can we do an interview with you? Oh, sorry, it's not convenient to do one. More and more we were rebuffed in recent years. And I was just speaking to an international journalist who's still up there and this week who told me that they have been summoned to the Foreign Ministry multiple times about stories they've written where multiple officials will print out and go through word for word and say, why did you use this word? It has a negative connotation. So the pressure really is quite intense for those who are still there.
Helena, I'll come back to you in a minute. I'll stay with you, Bill, just on this point. Given that you're no longer there, Australia doesn't have bureaus on the ground with Australian correspondents based there to report for Australia, and yet we're seeing what is being described as a new Cold War. We're seeing increasing rhetoric. We heard that today. People talking about potential conflict. Where are we at, do you think, in your assessment on the way that China is being reported right now?
Well, one of the great problems is that both China and say the West have respective echo chambers online for those who don't live in the respective countries they're talking about. What I mean by that is if you look at Weibo from outside, it looks like this hotbed of rabid nationalism, and by all accounts it is. But on the ground, of course, you're in touch with more liberal voices, more international open-minded voices. Many of those people now are keeping their heads down. Likewise in China, many of these nationalists who really are dominating the current discussion, they perhaps look at, say, the United States, they see the chaos of the pandemic, they see the protests and so forth, and they perhaps get a misperception of just how chaotic and how fast it's in decline.
Helena, just under a minute left, unfortunately. This is the tyranny of television, as you well know. But I want to get your thoughts on Chinese media and the rise of Chinese media like CGTN and the way they are representing the Chinese story to the world.
Well, I think it's absolutely marvelous from the Chinese point of view, especially compared with the 80s when the Chinese television news was just one series of statistics about factory had fulfilled its quota. It was fantastically boring. And as the Communist Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang said, the news should be bright, 80% bright, sunny news, maybe a fraction of dark, shaded news. But today, when I see Chinese television news, I'm astounded. It is really brilliant in its coverage, but of course, they've all been trained by specialists like you, Stan, and so they know all the tricks of the trade. The only thing is that when you analyze it, you realize what is missing. That they don't present. And that's the question, isn't it, Helena?
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Helena and Bill. That's all we have time for. Thanks for watching The Long March.